I don't know when I fell in love with Claire. It wasn't at first sight. It happened in the quiet, unspoken moments, in the spaces where nothing was said, yet everything was felt. She was my father's wife, my stepmother, the woman I should never have touched. But the line had already been crossed. My name is Noah. I'm 22 years old. This is the story of my life. I hadn't planned on moving back into my father's house after college. I could have stayed in another state, worked as a teaching assistant for another year, maybe even started grad school. But Dad didn't ask. He simply sent a short message, "Come back for a few weeks. There's a spare room." It's no warmth, no real invitation, just him being him. Claire, Dad's new wife, was someone I'd only met 3 times since their wedding twice. At family gatherings, once in a hotel lobby during a business trip. Each time, she was polite, composed, and distant, like someone who'd perfected the art of keeping people at arm's length. But living under the same roof reveals things casual meetings never do. Claire was subtle in ways that unsettled me. She didn't talk much, but every word she chose had a reason, as if weighed before leaving her lips. Her face gave nothing away, yet her eyes, those calm, dark eyes, always carried something beneath the surface. As if she were reading me like an open book. I can't pinpoint when I started noticing her differently. Maybe it was that first week. One afternoon, I passed the kitchen and saw her standing with her back to me, golden light spilling over her shoulders. Her hair was tied into a loose bun, and the back of her crisp white shirt was slightly wrinkled. She didn't turn around, but somehow I felt she knew I was watching. Claire wasn't like any other woman I'd ever known. Yes, she was still striking at 37, but it wasn't her beauty that drew me, it was her silence. It wasn't empty. It was deliberate, like a question waiting for an answer. I tried to remind myself who she was. That's Dad's wife. It's the woman he chose after Mom died. She has nothing to do with me by blood or by heart. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that my father and Claire weren't really in love. Dad was still his usual self-busy, cold, detached. Claire was quieter than him, but her quiet didn't feel like peace. It felt like surrender. They existed together, but it was lifeless. It's like 2 actors reading from entirely different scripts. 1 morning, as I washed my hands in the kitchen, Claire walked in, bringing with her a faint floral scent. She stood beside me to reach for a glass in the cupboard, and her hand brushed against mine. Maybe it was an accident, but it jolted through me like electricity. I turned, and she met my eyes. She didn't smile, didn't pull away, didn't apologize, just looked at me calmly. "Have you had breakfast?" she asked. I don't even remember if I answered. All I knew was that suddenly the kitchen felt smaller, as if we were both balancing on a tightrope, neither of us daring to take the first step. From that day forward, I realized the silence in this house wasn't harmless. It was alive, like something waiting in the dark, ready to strike at the smallest weakness. And I didn't know if it was Claire who started this, or me. I learned early in life that the most important things are the ones people never say. It's like Dad's affair. I never needed proof. I saw it in the way Claire sat across from him at dinner but wasn't really there, in how her eyes drifted past him when he talked about work. My father believed silence was power. When he didn't speak, he controlled the room. Claire's silence was different. It wasn't a weapon. It was resignation, the quiet of someone who had given up trying. I didn't know why they stayed together. Maybe for appearances, maybe for the money, maybe because ending it would take more effort than pretending. I started observing Claire not just with my eyes, but with something deeper. At first I tried avoiding her gaze, but the more I avoided, the more drawn I felt. Like there was an invisible thread pulling us closer every day. She was always composed, hair in a bun. White shirt, bare feet softly moving across the wooden floor. She kept just enough distance, walking past me too close to be casual, yet never close enough to cross any obvious line. One afternoon, I stood on the balcony reading when I saw her in the yard, watering the plants. She leaned slightly forward, her long skirt brushing against her legs, the collar of her blouse slipping just enough to reveal the curve of her neck in the sunlight. Our eyes met. She didn't look away, and neither did I in that moment. I stopped feeling like a lost son, staying temporarily in my father's house. For the first time, I felt like a man seen, acknowledged. Gradually, those small distances vanished. She would come into the kitchen when I was there, asking what I wanted to drink, sometimes brushing my hand when reaching for a glass, sometimes standing just a little too close. I kept wondering, was I imagining this? Or was she playing a game we both understood, but never spoke of? One night, as I cleared the table, she walked past me. I didn't turn around, but I could feel her eyes lingering on the back of my neck, waiting, almost daring me to turn. My pulse raced as if I had sprinted through traffic. What confused me most wasn't the tension. It was the anger I started feeling toward my father. Not for what he'd done to my mother, but for not seeing Claire. Or worse, for seeing her and not caring. I wanted to protect her. Childish, selfish desire, but also something deeper, a part of me that had longed for someone to truly see me and let me see them. That night I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs for water and found Claire sitting at the table, cup of tea in her hands, staring out the glass doors. I didn't want to disturb her. But as I turned to leave, she spoke. Noah, I froze. Yeah, she didn't look at me. Do you think there are people who live their whole lives without ever really being touched? I paused, watching her fingers curl slightly around the glass, as if holding on to the last bit of warmth. Yes, I said quietly. And I think there are people who spend their lives not touching anyone because they're afraid of being seen. Claire turned then, her eyes meeting mine. It felt like a door opening, and I knew if I took one more step, everything would change. But I didn't move. Neither did she. We just looked at each other, and somehow that silence felt more intimate than a kiss. Claire was a master of silence. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was something carefully measured, like music conducted without a single note played. The way she stirred her tea, the length of her gaze, even the pause before she spoke it, was all intentional at first. I thought I was imagining things, but as time passed, I knew better. She was leading me, and I was following. The mornings looked the same, but they weren't. Claire started wearing loose sweaters with slightly open collars, her hair falling over her shoulders instead of being tied up. She moved barefoot in the kitchen, her soft steps on the wooden floor sounding like a heartbeat trying to stay calm. One morning, I stood at the counter pouring coffee when she came closer than usual, so close I could feel the warmth of her body, smell the faint scent of her skin. She placed her hand on the counter, just beside mine. One small move, and our hands would have touched. "What are you going to study next?" she asked. The question was simple, but tone of it was something else except psychology. I answered. A little hoarse, Claire nodded, her lips curling slightly. Good, there are complex minds worth exploring. I wasn't sure if she wasted talking about me or herself. I began. Noticed myself, sometimes I stepped closer. When I passed her a glance that was longer than necessary, a gentle personal question, enough to probe the boundarious knot. Crossed them, but Claire was always one step ahead. Never too much, never too little. One evening, when Mark called to say he was staying an extra night, bet because of an emergency, I saw CLA's eye change for a split second, a reflex. That had been held back, but I caught it. She wasn't happy, she wasn't sad. She just saw opportunity. I didn't know where it had started. I didn't know who had stepped onto the board first, but now we were sitting across from each other in a strange game. There were no rules, no right moves, only was stopped first, and I began to realize something that fascinated and frightened. At the same time, Claire was no longer as one I was watching. She was watching, and I was moving in the direction she wanted me to go. I don't know when I started dreaming about Claire at first. It was just fragments, her silhouette gliding through the doorway, the faint sound of laughter in the kitchen, theft, scent of flowers clinging to tea sheets. Then the dreams became more vivid, more real, to the point where when I woke up, I had to sit still for a long time to separate the line between reality. I knew I shouldn't think like that. I couldn't, but forbidding miss made it drowsy lantly, like an addiction that builds in small doses until you can't turn back. Claire didn't do anything wrong. That's what drove me crazy. She never touched Maine. An inappropriate way, never said anything out offline, but everything she did, the way she whacked past me, bent over to get something, called my name in a low, even voice. Felt like tiny knives cutting into me defenses. I didn't know where the Linny was anymore. And I was sure she knew it too. It was a rainy evening and Mark hadn't come home yet. I was sitting on the balcony, my feet up on the railing, loosening to the wind blowing through the trees. Claire brought me a cup of hot ash. Wasn't wearing her usual long-sleeved top, just a thin cream sweater. The collar slightly drooped. Theolite from inside the house highlighted the curve of her collarbone. I didn't look away. I didn't have the sense to pretend to be indifferent. Any more unnoticed? You've been quieter than usual, Thies. Past few days. She sat down next to me, not too close, but close enough for me to hear her breathing. I'm trying to think. I answered about what I turned my head to look at her, about saying things I shouldn't have said. Claire looked at Mez long that I almost took back my words, but then she just nodded. Depends on Thelisoner. I took a deep breath. My head was pounding. I think I like you, I said quietly, but surely there was no thunderclap. No backlash. Just a pause, then Claire turned away, looking into the darkness. Of Thebekyard, do you think it's love, or is it just a fill-in? She asked, nodding around. I don't know. I said, honestly, I just know when I look at you, Aid, don't see you as my father's wife. I see a lonely woman, and I want to pull you out of that. Claire let out a small breath, Athen thread-like sigh. You don't need Anion to pull you, Shu whispered. You just need Simeone to see. We sat in the rain, either of us saying anything more. Butin. That moment I knew I had crossed a line in Claire. She didn't stop me. Nappergrass either. There are limits that people think they will never cross, until they realize they have crossed them for a long time. Just not brave enough to admit it that night. It did not rain. The air was dry, gloomy, as if everything was holding back something that weighs about. Tober's dad called to say he was late, a party with partners or a surplus meeting. I didn't care anymore. I looked at Claire as she hung up the phone, leaning against the kitchen counter. She was wearing a light brownie length dress. Her hair was loose, her eyes tired but not messy. She no longer hid her coldness when she mentioned Mark Mabe. She had never tried to hide it. I opened my mouth to say something, then closed it. There were no words. Pre-Cezino for the tension building. In Sadim only action. Claire turned her eyes, stopping on me. The light from the ceiling highlights the slight curve of her neck, blurring everything around here as if the light has chosen her as its focal point. I stepped closer, not in a hurry, asking, and Claire, she doesn't back away in that moment when I'm less than half a step away from her. I'm no longer Markson. I'm the only man in the house, standing before the only woman who's ever made me feel anything beautiful and significant. I don't want to guess it no more, I say. I don't want to keep things in my head that aren't true. Claire looks at me for a long time, no smile, no surprise. She just says very quietly, then stop guessing. We don't rush into each other like in the movies. There are no loud gestures, no loud words. Everything happens slowly, silent, liplessly. As if we've both written this script in advance. My hand rested on her waist. She touched my breast lightly, not pushing, not holding. We stared at each other for a long time before our lips met. Not a quick kiss, a question that didn't require an answer. I had never touched a Danyan like that, and sure she had never let anyone touch her like that, not for lack of opportunity, but for lack of truth. We found that out that night afterwards, well together without lights, without voices. The room was filled with breath and silence, but not the uncomfortable sense of the first weeks. I had moved in for the first time. The silence felt meaningful. I turned to look at Claire Shuas, lying on her side, the light from Thundo reflecting off her cheekbones. Wanted to say, I love you, but I knew Shuas ain't ready to hear it, and I wasn't ready to be rejected. Instead, I just stouched her shoulder lightly, feeling thrumph of the person I once thought was impossible. I couldn't sleep that night, not because of fear nor guilt, but Becca's. Some part of me didn't want toll of that moment. I lay next to Claire, counting her steady breathing in Theterk, as if I were trying to memorize a resound of something unrepeatable. Didn't turn to look at me when she awoke in the early hours of the mornings. Just got out of bed, put on her coat, and walked out of the room as if nothing had happened. Not a word, not a glance. I lay there waiting for some sign, a glance over my shoulder, a small comment, anything to prove that last night had been real and meaningful, but nothing. When I went downstairs, Claire wasn't. The kitchen making coffee. She was still in her long-sleeved shirt, her hair pulled back, her face calm. She turned when she heard my footsteps. "Did Yao sleep well?" she asked, as if we had just had a normal day. I nodded slowly. I Trito read her face. But it was no use. Claire had returned to her role, the calm woman, the wife of a successful bousins. The flawless stepmother. He wanted to ask, did last night really happen, but I didn't dare, because a new answer would be unbearable. We sat down too. Breakfast, fried eggs, toast, everything was arranged neatly, as if Ethod never been touched by any emotion. Couldn't bear it anymore. I didn't think Ethod would pretend nothing happened. Ethod, not looking at her. Claire put down her fork. "For what I know." Silence. Then sheiks. "Eld, you're young. Noah, everything I is for the first time you'll understand some things shapen because of loneliness, not because of love." I looked at her, and for the first time I saw the defensiveness in her eyes. "Are you trying to say that last night meant nothing you're saying? I should forget about it." I echoed. Not sad, not angry, just knowing. I had expected something she had never promised to give. "I can't." I said, "You can't expect me to walk past that like a shadow." Claire didn't answer. Shegus looked out the window, her eyes cold and silent. I skipped my meal and headed straight for the door. Didn't turn around as my hand reached for the doorknob. I heard her say behind me, "Don't love Manoah, because I won't forgive myself if you're hurt." I didn't answer because I wasn't hurt then, but I knew soon. I loved you not just last night, but long before that. Mark returned. Floor, Thea, sound of shoes in the hall, and a familiar, deep voice. "Claire." I was sitting on the sofa, my mind blank. Claire came out of her study as if everything was still running smoothly. Mark gave her a hug, planted kiss on her cheek. Claire smiled just enough. No one mentioned me event, though. I was sitting right there, just a few feet away. A few minutes later, Mark turned to me as if he had just remembered my existence. "So did you help Claire keep the house while Dad was away?" Looked at him a long time. "I think she's fine without Dad here." He reset his eyebrows. A faint smile appeared on his lips, half amused, half wary. "You're talking more maturely." These days I didn't answer. I could tell he was starting to get suspicious, and honestly I wanted him to be suspicious. That night I tried to avoid Claire. I didn't want to see her fall into the role of the perfect wife again, not after I'd seen her in a more emotional, more painful version. Heard them talking in the kitchen, the clinking of glasses, the splash of water. Claire's soft laugh as Mark told Mesamething about the conference. I was jealous, sad, and desperate. I knew she wasn't mine, never had been, but that didn't make it any easier. The next day at breakfast, I saw Mark looking at Claire in a way I'd never seen him look. At her beffer, as if he were checking her out, and he turned to me. "I'm working from home today. There's some reporting to doc." Claire paused for half a second as Shep poured her coffee. I looked at him straight in the eye. "Really? You usually avoid this house?" "Like the plague?" Mark put down his glass, grinning, toothless light. "Sounds like Noah wants to say something. You should hear." Claire looked up to intervene, but I spoke up. "It's just word. When you're away things feel-y." Mark looked at me as if he were peeling back layers off skin. "Nothing. No need." "That afternoon?" asked Mark past me in the hallway. He said softly enough for only I to hear, "How good do you think you are at hiding?" Turned. "And how good do you think you were at asking?" That was the final straw. Night we clashed, not with fists, with words, but they were as sharp ask knives. Mark stormed across the living room, his eyes deadly. Claire stood in the middle, trying to keep her cool, but I could see her hand shaking. "I know," he said. "I know from the way she looks at you, like a hungry dog that just saw food." I took a step forward. "At least I look Dad justiced her." He sneered. "She's my wife." "No," I said, not taking it back. "Dad never treated her like a wife. She was just a tool for his image as a stable businessman, a model family man, an empty shell." "Shut up," Mark growled. "Or what are you going to do? Hit me, kick me out? Go ahead. I'd rather sleep outside than live in this house and pretend everything is real." Claire burst into tears. Mark turned away, his voice hard. "Pack up. Get out off me house tonight." I didn't protest. I walked into the room, stuffed a few things into my backpack, and walked out. Claire stood near the door, tears still streaming down her face. I stopped, gazed at her for a long moment. I don't know if you regret it, but I don't. Claire didn't answer. She just put her hand to her chest as if holding something back, not letting it break it. Started to rain as I left the house. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I needed space to breathe, to forget the image of her standing next to a man who didn't deserve her and me who didn't deserve her. I drove down familiar streets, the rain lashing against the windshield, Lakia slap in the face. My heart was pounding. My hands were shaking. I heard her voice in my head, "Don't love me, Noah." The light was red. I slowed down. An SUV on the other side of the road swerved into the alone. Everything then faded into a blur off horns, screeching brakes, the sound, a metal clashing. I don't think words cankle. But sometimes they're the final push. I don't remember. The impact on like flash of headlights, the long piercing siren, and then everything turned to a deep, terrifying silence. No pain, no screams. Just the feeling of being pulled out of my body, floating somewhere between nothing and nothing. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw, waste white ceiling, the strong smell of fantaseptic, the steady hum of the machines. A bright light pierced my left eye. I closed it. I couldn't move. Everything felt pinned to the bed. A cold chill radiated from my ribs, but my mind was as blank as a room that had been empty for too long. I heard the first person. It was Claire. Her voice was uncrying. It wasn't shaking, but it waist-eared and heavy, as if she had been sitting there for hours, days without moving. "Can you hear that, Noah?" He couldn't answer, but I heard it. She told him about the first days, about the first time. I walked into the house, careful Asif, afraid to disturb the atmosphere. About the first time. I talked back to Mark, and she felt proud even though she didn't say it then. Her voice dropped. "I'm sorry I couldn't open my eyes, but I knew she was there, Claire." You could feel the change in the air every time. She entered the coolness of their room, softening the click of high heels on the floor, the familiar scent off jasmine. Tea wafting like an old memory. I had been lying here for days. My consciousness was in an out-of-focused outside world, passed by like a frosted glass. I could see images, hear voices, but I couldn't touch anything. I heard Claire whispering every day sometimes. It was small talk of booth roses blooming in the yard, about the stray cat sleeping on the roof, about the dishwasher making its usual loud noise. But today, she didn't tell a story. She just stayed silent for a long time. Then she spoke slowly, as if peeling away the layers of skin from her heart. Noah, her voice caught, then softened. I thought I was the one who had everything under control. I never wanted anyone to see my weakness. Not even my husband. I wanted to tell her. I did, and I didn't look away. But then you walked into that house with that clear look, and the way you weren't treating to take me, just be there looking at me like I really existed. I wanted to touch her hand, to squeeze it, to tell her she wasn't alone. "I'm not sure I love you, but I know no one has ever made me feel this, real, even when I'm wrong." Silence. I thought she was going to stand up, walk out, leave me with my unfinished sentence. But then, "You're not a replacement. You're the first person who made me feel real." Her voice broke like a thread being pulled tight, and then like a reflex that came from nowhere. I tried to lift my hand, heavy, very heavy, but then one of my fingers touched hers. Her hand squeezed mine immediately. No screams, no tears. That's just a breath that escaped, as if she had been holding her breath the entire time I was unconscious. "You heard right," she whispered. I couldn't answer, but I hoped that touch was enough to say it all. That time that followed blurred. I was dreaming between reality and illusion, but one thing I was sure. Off life is a fragile thing, but the feeling off love, that is something harder to than death. I don't remember the exact moment I woke up. It wasn't like a movie. There was no constant buzzing or a jerk thought. Made my eyes open, just a feeling as soft as a whisper, like when you're drowning and suddenly someone echoes your name from the shore the first time. I moved my hand. It was shaking like it didn't belong to me anymore, but I felt live, like a very faint light at the end. A long tunnel in my hand was held by Somion. I knew it was Claire. I didn't heed to open my eyes to know whose warmth it was. She didn't say anything off that moment, but I heard it all, the stifled breathing, the silent crying, the trembling hands trying to hold on to what was left of me in this world. I didn't know how long I lay there, but it was enough to know what was between. Ask could never be. The same again in Theotis that followed. I was still weakenable to speak, only to move slightly bit. I could feel the change Beth in her. And in me, Claire was not Thesom woman. I had known her eyes were a deeper, her silent CVR. She cared for me as if she were paying a debt, not with words, but with every gesture. Diadru. So I saw her once slumped by his window of the hospital room. Her eyes were closed, her hand on her stomach very gently, very carefully thought gesture it. It was not for me, not entirely, when I was well enough to be transferred to the observation room. She sat by the bed, silent as usual. I tried to open my mouth. My voice was weak, hoarse, but the question came out before I could even think. Are you okay, Claire? Was startled. She looked at me in firmament. Her eyes held 1,000 answers, but then, as usual, she just smiled slightly. You're awake. What could be better? I didn't ask. Any more questions? But I knew she was hiding something, and then I saw it. She turned away, and her hand touched her belly again. But this time it was Tunchencius. After that day, I thought more about what no one had dared to say, Claire and I. We had crossed the line, Anmark. Though silent, definitely knew the question. No one had asked if Claire was pregnant. Whose baby was it? I had never feared the answer like that. A week later, I was discharged from the hospital. Claire came to see me off without Mark. We stood under the hospital awning. The sky was dark, just like the afternoon. I left that house by for the accident. Thank you for staying with me until the end.